Privileged to introduce our distinguished guest for today, Professor Vikas Gupta from the Department of History, University of Delhi. Professor Gupta is a respected scholar whose work spans the intersection of history, education, and social inequality. His academic contributions reflect both depth and engagement with pressing contemporary concerns in Indian education. He has co-edited the important volume Modernity, Education, and Inequality, published in 2021, along with Teaching History, published in 2013 with Professor K.M. Shimari and others. His scholarship extends across numerous book chapters and articles in leading journals, making him a widely recognized voice in the beyond his publications. Professor Gupta plays an important role in shaping academic and social discourse. He serves on editorial boards of reputed journals, including Contemporary Education Dialogue, and contributes to several organizations such as the Indian Social Science Academy, the All Science Forum for the Right to Education, and the Disability Rights Front. His commitment to inclusive and equitable education is evident not only in his research, but also in his institutional and public engagements. He has been the recipient of prestigious fellowships and research grants from institutions such as the Indian Council of Historical Research, the German Historical Institute, the Max Weber Foundation, and the Charles Bonus Trust. His lectures have enriched audiences across both national and international platforms. We are truly honored to have him with us today. As a small token of our respect and gratitude, we would like to warmly present him. Now, without much further ado, I invite Professor Vikas Gupta to please share his.
Um, it is indeed a matter of uh, great privilege and honor to speak at with the students of very historically important institution of higher education. Of course, today is not the time to talk about uh, the prestigious history of this college, uh, but I think it's really very important to also keep this the legacy of this college also as part of the discussion on the aspects of knowledge production in Colonial India. Of course, something that I will not be dealing with, but that's definitely one, you could say, example of the contested nature of knowledge in Colonial. Uh, the important thing that at the outset we need to understand is a problem in a lot of existing historiography and scholarship on film. A lot of this scholarship assumes a flat relationship of knowledge, speech, and people. It almost assumes a kind of a singular objective of knowledge itself. It assumes as if the colonial state had one objective and was able to singularly make the entire epistemological domain to the extent that for perhaps an overwhelming majority of our population, colonialism equals. And one myth, if we, I can use that term, uh, features at the core of all such assumptions is the disproportionately load the box of figures like Charles Grant, Brett Duff, Polly, and Whitsley, the anti-sexist. Even when I read a lot of standard textbooks on colonial knowledge and the way they filter down to the answer sheets of our own students, I find a very straightforward measure of the development of modern knowledge in colonial. So, but at the same time, over last, particularly last 2 decades or so, there has emerged a significant body of literature, historically more informed literature, that seeks to challenge this framework. Uh, and what then we tend to realize is something more complex, something which is uh, uh, more, which has a more checkered kind of, you know, knowledge production in colonial India was not, I suggest, a simple transfer of Western ideas to Indian. No. It was a complex and contested process. It involved multiple actors or historical, agents. Multiple. Remember, it operated through very different kinds of institutions, very different kinds of institutions, calling even for a comparative analysis of the different institutions of knowledge production in the. You cannot simply understand it from one kind of. It interacted, the colonial knowledge interacted with older traditions, colonial states, Christian missionaries, Orientalists, Anglicists, vernacularists, and various kinds of community leaders all participated in the production and reproduction of colonial knowledge, even though this all was happening within the hegemonic structure of colonial power relations, recognizing the participation of these indigenous members is very important, because it is this which shapes the nature of knowledge in the area, and which then continues to influence us till date. So if you have to understand the implications of colonial knowledge for our own times, then you need to decode the nature of colonial knowledge as produced through, as produced within the power dynamics of colonial state, but by the involvement of different kinds of even these people. So I mean, I'll come to that. So I mean, each of these groups had very different objectives. Even within their, I mean, even within each of these groups, there was no uniformity, whichever group that you talk about, because power relations were not located only between the colonizer and the colonized. Hmm? Power relations also existed heterogeneity also existed between, these different uh, non-state actors or interlocutors as well. Their interaction, their interaction produced a dynamic field of knowledge. Meaning it was, even this field was not static. There is, I mean, you cannot think of colonial knowledge also as something, a static body of a static epistemic body. Okay? There are shifts within this body as well. There are shapes, diversities within this body of knowledge as well. This field was shaped by, by power. It also contained it also contained negotiations and resistance. And in order to understand this, we also need to briefly juxtapose the knowledge ecology or knowledge sphere of colonial period with the pre-colonial, pre-modern knowledge ecology of India. Okay? Because there exists in India a rich and diverse system of knowledge. These systems, although this term in itself is somewhat anachronistic, but whatever, this ecology, or these different systems were, uh, you could say, decentralized, even just decentralized, I would say non-centralized, not even decentralized. They were embedded in social and cultural context. Pathshalas, maktabs, madrasas, hmm, and schools, gurukuls, hmm, uh, various forms of apprenticeships, okay, and agraharam, and all various other kinds of ceremonies of learning functioned across different regions of Indian subcontinent. These institutions did not follow a uniform curriculum. Teachers exercised a, you could say, autonomous agency. Communities supported these institutions, although many of them also received support from state revenues or land grants. For example, early 19th century surveys, early 19th surveys in, Bengal, Bombay, etc., provinces, show these surveys, show the dense network of village schools and higher institutions of learning. Okay, these are usually known as the surveys on indigenous education. Instruction often, I mean, instruction provided within many of these institutions was formal, but there also existed many other kinds of learning setups which were not initially regarded as formal, although we regard them formal today. Different kinds of, for example, if you look at, what you study in engineering today, or, metallurgy, for example, huh? Or so these are the things that were learned in the workshops, not part of that kind of a certification that you receive today. So you have to then expand the meaning of the term formal education in that period, in the pre-colonial period, understand the larger scale of the production and reproduction of knowledge. However, this does not, of course, this does not mean that all of these knowledges in the pre-modern period had no hierarchical relationship with each other, right? So even in that period, you do find that the scriptural knowledge did receive much higher prestige than practical knowledge, which also coincided in our specific case with caste and class hierarchy, right? Uh, uh, but for us, the most important point of to understand at this juncture is that is two things. That knowledge, even in that period, was not confined only to religious or scriptural texts, and that knowledge did not require an effort on part of any group of intelligentsia or state officials to be standardized and codified uh, in the way we see it happening in the subsequent period, in the sense that different institutions could continue to impart different kinds of knowledges without necessarily entering into a debate over what is worthy knowledge to be taught to them. Right? However, these systems were, uh, uh, however, colonial rule intervened in this existing lens. But the spread of modern knowledge in India began, and that's very important for me, began long before the famous myth of Thomas Berry's methodology of Italy. The process the process of the spread of modern knowledge in the Indian subcontinent started gradually during 18th century. Okay, missionaries were amongst the. I mean, there are two particular categories. One is called the Dubhashiyas, the people who were the interpreters between different European companies and Indian, producers and agents, etc. And second were Christian missionaries. Okay, uh, you might have read more about these Dubhashiyas who in your units pertaining to the early modern trade in the Indian subcontinent, the arrival of European companies, etc., etc. When you look at, for example, places like Bengal or uh, or Pondicherry or Coromandel or Malabar regions, you will understand this where that there is a long process, I mean, through which uh, people in India began to realize the need and the necessity of acquiring modern knowledge, at least initially to acquire non-Indian language. Right? Then missionaries. Missionaries were amongst the earliest promoters of modern knowledge in India. In 1706, and I'm going more than 125 years before Macaulay. In 1706, German missionaries trained under August Francaise at Halle University. These were Lutherans. Uh, they arrived in Tramadour on the Coromandel coast in 1706. They established schools, disciplines. They established schools that taught literacy in the modern form. Literacy, arithmetics, practical modern sciences, and technical skills. These institutions was these institutions were small but significant. These institutions introduced new pedagogical methods and new forms of knowledge. Missionary schools expanded in southern India and basically shifting the goalpost from Calcutta to south. Okay? So Uh, these missionary schools spread in southern India during the 18th century. English education was not yet dominant. English education was yet not dominant. Still, what you find is that exposure to Western science and new textbooks had been. By the 1780s, okay, so within a period of 75 years, by the 1780s, English medium schools spread. English medium schools appeared or spread in several South Indian regions. Local rulers sometimes supported these schools. For example, Rajas of Brahman, Shivaganga, and Tanjavur patronized these schools. In fact, there is evidence that a good number of such schools began receiving grants even from the British East India Company in 1780s. This is something that has been very well documented by Robert E. Price. He also shows that and Brahmins and wealthier elites or gentry sent their sons, not just the lower caste, remember, and not just the missionaries. Now the Rajas have also got involved. So Bellar and other members of elite sent their sons, to these schools to learn English and modern subjects. Missionaries also played an important role in Bengal. Remember, and you might have this very fascinating work on this Sirampur missionaries by James Long. Sorry, no, just forgetting. Um, uh, Jeffrey Audi. And, you know, this these missionaries demonstrate a completely different approach because they arrived at this Danish settlement called Sirampur, not in the British territory, and they focused not just on keeping books in English, but carried out a lot of translation from Sanskrit to Bengali and from Sanskrit to English, from English to Bengali. They established even a printing press. In fact, the Sirampur trio, as has been studied by Sujit Sarkaram, played a very, very important role in the dissemination of scientific knowledge. William Carey established a botanical garden. Remember, it's a very crucial intervention. In fact, by the middle of the 19th century, something that I'm moving towards slowly, we really found a lot of enthusiasm in India about the achievement of Western scientific. And I think these early developments play a very, very important role. There's very fascinating work by Dara Peterson, where she shows how uh, uh, Leslie Wilkinson's group of pundits, they debated on different issues, in Malwa, and and how, for example, the principal of Banaras College, the Valentine, tried to engraft uh, Western knowledge on Indian culture and tradition. All missionaries were not just, I mean, it's not just one kind of knowledge that missionaries explored. So there's this very interesting work by Ian Lufana on Goa, where called Disputed Missions, where he very interestingly shows how different missionaries adopted different strategies. And, while conversion might have been one of their objectives, stated objective, the outcome was very minimal. And I remember, I mean, this very interesting statement made by William Carey, focusing on rural vernacular education, saying that Europeans have not understood Indian or Bengalis. They have misrepresented them because they kept Europe as their standard. Okay? So, uh, and then as we shall see later, I mean, so they were involved in the production of grammars, in the invention of scripts, in the compilation of dictionaries, in the printing of classic manuscripts, in the standardization of modern languages and printing of books. And as we see, I mean, this is the one aspect, as we see later on in the second of the 19th centuries, some of these missionaries started raising objections on printed textbooks because they, according to them, these books contain, irrespectful references to Christianity. And on the other hand, I mean, the vernacular Indian material contained irrespectful, mentions to Christianity. And on the other, and the English, and they said that while in the English, while the English books, attempts have been made to kind of purge, delete all references to Christianity, the vernacular books have been full with allusions and references to Hinduism and Islam. I mean, I can elaborate that in the course of the discussion. So, and this really became a big issue in the uh, particularly third and the fourth quarter of the 19th century, uh, which I believe was quite catalyst in the post-1857 period to push Indian education towards adopting a more secular path. Okay, that was a big controversy in the 1860s and 70s, leading to the establishment of the first All India Textbook Committee, which is known as the Simla Textbook Committee, which for the first time prepared some rules how textbooks should be prepared. But I'm not going into the details of that. I've written about that in some other ways. I'm going to refer to parts of it as I see. So, the other uh, um, uh, uh, important, uh, uh, you could say, trend, intellectual response to India by Europeans hmm, uh, would be seen in now what is known as Indology or Orientalism. Okay? This began in the late 18th century. In the logical studies of India began in the late 18th century. British officials and scholars tried to understand Indian society through its classical texts. Institutions like Asiatic Society of Bengal were established. Scholars collected manuscripts written in classical language. They studied languages like Sanskrit, Arabic, and Persian. They translated texts written in these languages in English or in modern other modern languages. They this marked the beginning of systematic European scholarship on India, known as Indological studies. Indology developed as a field of knowledge. Orientalist scholars studied Sanskrit, Persian, and Arabic texts. They classified Indian society through textual tradition. Now try to understand this. It's very, very important. Okay. For example, William Jones. William Jones compared Sanskrit with Greek and Latin. He proposed a common Indo-European. He proposed a common Indo-European uh, you could say, origin of Indian civilization and people. Charles Wilkins translated Bhagavad Gita. Nathaniel Hezek codified Hindu laws. I mean, but a lot of this was happening under foreign message. These acts were both scholarly and driven by administrative means. These started, these were seen as quite crucial for colonial governance. They provided legal framework for the colonial state to govern Indian society. They created categories such as ancient India and remember, I mean, this tripartite division, came from people like Berghain in Europe, ancient, medieval, and modern. Yeah? And the class and the classical civilization in itself is something that related to the post-Renaissance development in Europe. Okay? Uh, these these scholars presuppose a direct relationship between knowledge that is derived from the study of languages and literature at one end, and the development of ethnographic and racial distinctions on the other. So this is another kind of a problem that has been found in this board of literature. They also believe that the knowledge of classical languages like Sanskrit, Persian, and Arabic is necessary for better learning of other modern local or regional languages. For example, Sanskrit for Hindi, yeah, or other, I mean, Assamese or I mean, learning all other, I mean, as a mother of Indian languages. Okay? Indology privilege texts over lived practice. So that is why in this period, what you find is that rather than focusing on the living customs of people, the way they practice by the communities in different parts of the country, they focus on codifying Hindu and Muslim personal law through the text chosen from by the experts, religious experts and legal experts from certain parts of the country, focus on certain texts and therefore privilege some over others. It treated Brahminical ideology, treated Brahminical scriptures as authoritative. It marginalized popular tradition. For example, caste was understood through textual description. Regional variations were ignored. This produced a static image of Indian society. Sentiments moreover late will take this ideological framework to its final key point. This was irrespective. So they constructed the idea of foreign civilization. These ideas entered education system or educational norm. These influenced history rights. These shaped debates on identity. So, for example, we find that this Aryan non-Aryan distinction was used to explain social hierarchy. These ideas were later contested by thinkers and community leaders, including Jyotirao Phule, uh, Perrier, and Dr. T.R. Ambedkar. Yeah, in different ways, really. I mean, if you look at all three of them, there are differences. I mean, how Pule makes use of it to bolster his claim for caste oppression and to underline how Aryans are outsiders, etc., etc. Periyar uses it to, yeah, to mount claims of the southern people and how Ambedkar finds problems with this racial distinction. It is also appropriate uh, uh, at this point to also look at another term, which is, as I said at the beginning of this lecture, the I mean, the uniform understanding of the impact of the Anglicist, quote unquote, the Anglicist term as represented by me. That's the other thing that I want to talk about. So we find that Macaulay's minutes of 1835 proposed English education, of course, but what we need to remember is that it, it privileged European knowledge, not simply about language. It is a major concern here is knowledge and utility, because after all, Macaulay was inspired by evangelicalism as well as utilitarianism of Jeremy Bentham. And that, of course, he dismissed Indian traditions. Um, but it has to be seen in context of the debate that he was having with the Orientalists, who were kind of talking about the glorious Indian past. We have to keep that thing in mind. The development of colonial education followed, you know, has followed actually multiple trajectories, not simply the one that was suggested by Macaulay and Wilson. It did not uh, uniformly follow Macaulay model. It's very interesting that, in fact, the London Authority, that is, London Authorities was represented by the Secretary of State, the Board of Control and the Board of Directors. Okay, so which was a higher authority than the Calcutta government, right? So it is on record that the London authorities did not actually agree or approve Bentinck's resolution that followed from the minute of economy. It is a long story why they did not send a cancellation order. They did not because they thought, the next Governor General Lord Auckland advised them not to do so because this will, kind of be a scar on the power of the British authority in India. That's the yoga. The order of one colonial official is cancelled by a higher authority. It will become a big news. So we said I'll take care of it. We advised Charnak not to send such an order. Okay, but that draft was read. Later administrators rather attempted to make a compromise between Orientalist and Anglicist approaches. In, uh, so we find that for example, in the Bombay Presidency, Elphinstone emphasized vernacular medium for elementary education, particularly that of the rural people and also of some. While English and English education for modern elites and Sanskrit education for traditional elites that was patronized previously by the Peshwa rule. So he continued with the Dakshina Fund, for example. He supported dissemination of knowledge in local languages. He aimed to reach broader popular base of his education. This approach differs from, from Macaulay's uh, uh, quote unquote elitist model as is attributed to him. because even this in its this uh, elitist approach has been now questioned by, for example, Parmila Vidao recently, and he also, where it has been shown that the schools that Macaulay himself opened were very different. These provided education in local languages, charged no fee, admitted all kinds of students from rich to poor, from the lower caste to upper caste, Indians and Europeans. But it's also it also allowed coexistence of classical languages. I mean, if you look at Alphonsus model, classical languages, English and Marathi or other languages together. What we also find is that the next Governor General of India, Lord Auckland, Lord Auckland, in his minute of you know, forget the exact date, but 1839, allocated funds for both classical and English education, not just for one, despite Bentinck's resolution. Okay, he allocated funds to both the Orientalist and the rest. The Court of Directors dispatch of 1841 recommended combining European knowledge with vernacular language. Okay, meaning, so I mean, and at this juncture, it can also tell you that when you look at the dispatch of 1854, it also very clearly said that while English would be the medium for education for those who can afford to receive instruction in that language, meaning the traditionally learned classes or the upper classes, upper caste, etc. But vernaculars will be the medium of education for rest of the population. However, the uh, knowledge that is to be imparted will be will be European, modern European, useful, scientific. Of course, to what extent was this scientific is another matter of debate. Um, and I'll come to that in a while. Okay? Um, many educational institutions also combine traditional and modern. For example, when you look at it's Banaras college under James at the time, I referred here. Uh, Valentine attempted to reinterpret Sanskrit texts in light of Western science and Christianity. Valentine believed that Western knowledge would be presented as a continuation of Indian philosophical tradition, so that Indian people accept it. If you study, so his purpose of studying classical texts is very different. Despite Macaulay's period, this is in the 1840s. What is he trying? Valentine tried to still focus on classical knowledge. Why? He thought that the reception of European knowledge would increase if we show to Indians that it is nothing but the logical culmination of the studies that your own ancestors carried out in the classical period. Okay, that you have not taken that logical culmination, and that is why you are still at the backward stage, but Europeans have taken it into that's different. But by following the same footstep, you can also become modern, developed, etc. And he thought that for this, he needs to use the authority of learned funding. So they need to be picked. This is happening in 1940 because they can show that oh yes, this particular European thing, the modern Western principle is also alluded to in an ancient text. People will accept it more readily. Okay. Uh, then Delhi College, another very interesting stuff. Okay. Delhi College uh, uh, became a very remarkable center of intellectual synthesis, right? Between traditional and modern, Eastern, Western, English and working with oral and written, okay? Institutionalized teaching and uh, Ustad. I mean, the Delhi College, I mean, the checkered history, but the what's known as now the Zakir Hussain College. Yeah? What you find is that originally it was a uh, madrasa established by Tajuddin Khan, who was the say the who was the commander in the army or the thing. Then it received you know funding from both uh, a Muslim endowment uh, uh, by the uh, Nawab, by the Diwan of the Nawab of Lucknow, and also following some recommendations of Lord Lake and others, grants from the East India Company. And what happened at this college, you see, people who were involved in the teaching of, say, the Mughal gentry and other upper classes of Delhi got education alongside with many people, talented people from humble origin. Here, the language and so the term Delhi Renaissance, one is Bengal Renaissance that you might have come across, the other is Delhi Renaissance. The Delhi Renaissance term was actually attributed to the work of this college. Here, teachers sat along with their students, engaged with modern texts, mostly written in English, translated them, studied them in Urdu, not in English. This is happening exactly at the same time when English is being developed in then you go to the current day UP by and large, or the northwestern provinces and our under HS Beats and Kubesan, they they developed a full system, a very elaborate system of Halkavati school, where the focus was on vernacular rural education. Okay, and if you look at the work of Agra College in this period, uh, following in the footsteps of the Fort William College, which was established in Calcutta in 1800, they carried on the printing of books in Hindi, Urdu, and other North Indian languages and made them part of their syllabus. Both Agra College and Delhi College carried out very important work in translation. Delhi College had a translation society as well. And this is also the period when, I mean, you have heard Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, later Sir Syed Ahmad Khan established the Gazipur Scientific Society, the Translation Society, and worked with many other people, including the Aula, which I will talk about just in a while. So there's another, kind of, so after, and then what you see is another very interesting thing. See, Punjab was annexed in 1849, right? Now, in Punjab, the British East India Company's government adopted Urdu as the medium of administration, as the language of administration, even though they not even though Punjabi was the language of you thought that it will ensure continuity, with previous rule. And this is the time, within 1837, they had abolished Persian as the language of administration and replaced it with vernacular. Okay, so that's another kind of presently that we see. So again, I mean, keep giving you examples from these different parts to show, how complex the uh, is the terrain of epistemology and language in colonial India. Uh, 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 and this is the time when in Bombay presidency, another very renowned educationist, Colonel uh, uh, George Jervis, very strongly supported the vernacular vernacularist. Okay, Jervis translated scientific texts. I mean, he was appointed as this leadership Vidyalaya, the engineering college established by Elphinstone, and he translated scientific texts into Marathi and Gujarati. He argued that education was, uh, he argued that education through an unfamiliar language would restrict knowledge to a small elite. In fact, he compared it with the kind of the transformation that happened in England in Europe. He said that the non the democratization of knowledge happened in Europe following the disintegration of America. So India cannot be an exception. Okay? Uh, so this, the another important aspect of knowledge production in colonial India is that colonial modernity transformed the structure of knowledge production itself. It introduced centralized administration. It introduced centralized administration. It created departments of education, something completely new in the history of education. It standardized curriculum. It became institutionalized now, unlike the previous situation where it was the teacher who decides everything about the production and reproduction of knowledge. It was prescribed, this new knowledge was prescribed by the state. This marked a shift from non-centralized to increasingly centralized process of knowledge production. For example, government approved textbooks replaced locally produced textbooks, not completely. Print culture expanded it further. Knowledge became more uniform and standard. However, this system was not without its contradictions or incoherences. It was marked by contradictions and contradictions. This the colonial state aimed to maintain order in society. Therefore, it avoided radical transformation, something otherwise attributed to colonial knowledge traditionally by historians. Missionaries aimed to promote religious instruction. However, see the contradictions. They were instrumental in the evolution of secular curriculum and scientific knowledge. On the other hand, the Indian elites, Indian elites uh, inserted, what you could say, infused or inserted their own perspective in colonial knowledge. We see that curricular knowledge reflected competing agendas and influences. Uh, so if you had the missionary text, then you also had, for example, Ramcharitmanas, Ayodhya Kand, parts of it, or you had that Prem Sagar, which was the translation of a chapter of Eco Ways, or you had these works that were written literature that was produced by Nazir Ahmad or Ali and many others, you know, uh, that rely on both Victorian norms of morality and whatever civics. On the other hand, also harp upon the classical value system. But what you find is that when you look at, for example, when you look at uh, the overall configuration and the presupposed the overall configuration, symbolic configuration, presupposed leadership, and the tone of this architecture. For example, in the case of uh, Hindi, uh, uh, I mean, the knowledge of Hindi, North and Central India, it presupposed a Hindu leadership. It presupposed the return of a mythologized past. Okay? Uh, uh, and when you look at the uh, so that coexists with all shifts toward secular rhetoric. It coexisted. Similarly, when you look at the textbooks that were produced for women, these emphasize domestic role and responsibility. Works like uh, Sri Shiksha, Sri Dharma Tarandini, uh, and so on and so forth, define women as wives and mothers. They did not challenge patriarchy and patriarchal norms. They reproduced, rather, they reproduced it with a modern education and modern context. Education, this, on the other hand, we also have, examples like Rukmabai, Sultan Stream, and other writings, yeah, which provide us an important example of contestation. He challenged both traditional patriarchy and colonial legal structures. Her case against child marriage, her case against child marriage and enforced widowhood became a site of public debate. She argued for women's rights, including right to education and consent for divorce. She used legal reasons. She also used personal experience to write public plan. Her writings show how women intervened in knowledge production and reproduction in colonial India. They, these writings question the dominant norm. These expose contradictions within both indigenous and colonial systems of knowledge production and reproduction in India. Colonial knowledge also was also colonial knowledge uh, sought to reshape social identity. It introduced new concepts, such as population and backwardness and forwardness. Okay, these were new concepts. Okay, colonial discourse portrayed. So this presupposition, this concept of population and the phenomena of backwardness and forwardness is facilitated by different kinds of data and records that were prepared by the global state was a new dynamism. And just say it extensively about it. Colonial discourse portrayed Muslim as backwards. Okay, it attributed. So this started with William Wilson Hunter's the Indian Musalmans and his debate with Sir Sayyid Ahmad Khan and a lot of other interventions and a lot of So you know so uh, this attribute it attributed, the colonial discourse attributed this backwardness to, cultural factors. However, what you also find that the reality was more nuanced. Okay, what we find is that the wealthier Muslim families avoided colonial schools and colleges because Persian and Arabic were excluded. They increasingly excluded, not from the initially, but because by the end of the 19th century, they began to see these languages as foreign languages. They fear the loss of identity. Textbooks contained offensive references. Middle class Muslims, but middle class Muslims, however, participated more in. This what we find is the participation of very class. There's a class. So not just simply a religious division. Okay, and then there are also those interlocutors of the domain of knowledge production who laid emphasis on the structural factors that contributed to inequities, social inequities. You know, so for example, I have shown in my work you know, uh, on uh, Lahaula. How uh, um, uh, focus on issues like uh, the manner in which the resources of the work were mishandled and misappropriated, how teachers were not appropriately trained to teach the first generation learners, how there was overcrowding in classrooms, etc., etc. That these were not simply knowledge categories focusing on religion, but structural categories that shape these discourses on backwardness and forward. Okay, so so these alternative epistemologies are very, very important. And I think the last example that one can quote here is from Jyotirao Phule. Yeah, uh, you know uh, challenge both the rabbinical as well as colonial knowledge traditions as produced in colonial India. He emphasized the experience as the basis of knowledge, something that Umesh Bagari has very interestingly written about in my own work. And they argue that lived realities of oppression should generate moral uh, moral insight for scholars. He used examples of caste humiliation and labor exploitation. He showed how everyday experience could produce critical knowledge. This approach, this approach sought to democratize knowledge production. If you look at his own testimony before under commission, his manner, he focuses on the need to have teachers who do not hesitate to hold the handle of the plow or the axe is this serious uh, cost to bridge the social divide in colonial knowledge. So what we find to conclude is that knowledge production in colonial India was a complex and uneven contested process. It was shaped by colonial power, but also involved indigenous participation and other non-state actors, both from India and abroad. It transformed earlier system of knowledge production. It retained elements of both continuity and change. It produced new hierarchies. It enabled critique and as I mean it facilitated co-option, but also enabled critique and resistance. It created modern uh, modern public sphere. It reproduced inequalities, but at the same time, it facilitated contestation of privilege inequality. Therefore, colonial knowledge should be understood as a dynamic field of negotiation. It was a site of power, conflict, as well as creativity. Therefore, it's not enough to simply dump it down. It's also a I mean, I have not, I mean, there are many, many examples, I mean, that I can talk about in detail, but I haven't done that. It's, its legacy continues to shape contemporary debates on, on knowledge, education, identity, society, culture, and nation. Uh, it can, I mean, there's no way that one can just wish it away and then go back to the past. One has to adopt a very critical but careful attitude to ensure that the baby is not thrown with the mother. And well, I do not know if you have patience and energies to ask questions, or comments. But in case you do, would be equally rewarding for this opportunity.
You have a question? Uh, I understand that to lecture adds nuance and complexity to the reductionist view that reductionist view of the dispatch of the elitist. But how does one reconcile the idealism expressed by the analysis, that is modern knowledge in English for those who can afford it, dear Vikas and so on, and vernacular knowledge lacking modern for those who can't, with the commonly held um, historical view that we have that presents English education primarily as a strategy to create a small intermediary elite for colonial administration.
Um, uh, uh, a, of course, the outcome of this linguistic hierarchy in colonial knowledge has been, uh, could be seen in terms of a new elite, which includes few people from all walks of life, without transforming the lives of majority of people in all these socio-economic or religious categories. That is very much there, but um, uh, to see this simply as a colonial strategy would fail us to understand the resistance that the process of change and the participation of marginalized people met from the elites of Indian society itself. Who were the people revolting when Dalits and women or girls were going to attend? Were these Indian people or the white? We need to understand that. Therefore, it's important to see that it's not enough to, although it is important, but not enough to see education through the lens in which, say, Martin Carnoy, for example, in cultural imperialism trained us. Look at it. Of course, unlike some recent trends, I'm not going against Carnoy's argument, but in my uh, view, the need is also to see that it's not simply the metropole, whose elitism and whose colonialism kind of kept knowledge restricted to a select few from different sections, but also the people in South Asia, the dominant people in South Asia were collaborating in keeping, the fruits of modern knowledge restricted to very few people. I mean, if you look at a very interesting example, when you look at, the early 20th century discourses, what people were saying that if everybody goes to work and go to school, who will work in our farm? This is what the Raja of Darbhanga was saying, or this is what these, Mang and other villages in this region of Delhi, the Bhavana region in Delhi in the 1940s were saying that we can't afford to send everybody to school because who will work in our farm? You understand? So the point is that you have to understand the, uh, I mean, particular house with other work where, I mean, she has focused on, for example, Bhargava Tila, in the way he cautions against, women's education and particularly their higher education. And so we have to really see that it's not just one factor, but there are multiple factors that are shaping this.
That's a good question.
All right, think about it. Talk about it. Eat like it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vikas, sir, for giving this lecture and especially for taking out this time to come to college. Tuesdays are the only days that sir is free, so we specifically kept it on Tuesday. Uh, uh, the lecture itself, I think it was very relevant for especially UG students, since this is a big part of our syllabus and a part of the entire all the discourse today that is going on regarding education, regarding how the debate about Indian college systems uh, takes up a big place in campus discourse. So I think definitely people from here will have a lot of thinking about that, and they will regard this entire process of knowledge production not as a linear process and something as more complicated, something as more complicated. Thank you so much, sir, for taking out the time, and thank you everyone for being here.